Great, and then we'll get started. Okay. First of all, I just want to say welcome to everybody and thank you so much for attending. I'm going to do a little bit of introductions and then we'll get started. My name is Patty Draper. I'm the director of the Transplant Mentors program at Gift of Life, and I'm going to be facilitating this discussion this evening. First, we're just going to do a brief introduction into Gift of Life and the way that our programs function. Gift of Life is a nonprofit organization that promotes support, awareness, and success of organ, eye, and tissue donation through education, mentoring, and collaboration with our partners in the community and individuals across the transplant community. Transplant Mentors is one of our 2 signature programs offered by Gift of Life. We'll be talking about mentorship off and on throughout tonight's conversation, so you can feel familiar even if you've not heard of it yet. And then the Transplant Mentors program, it's offered nationwide and pairs trained mentors like Kritisha, James, and Wes, who are with us today, with transplant recipients and their care partners, as well as living donors, to provide insight, education, support, and encouragement throughout the transplant process. So first, I'd really like to take a moment to thank and introduce our panelists. The first person we're going to introduce is Wes Hawkins. He lives in, am I saying it right, Ponca City, Oklahoma?
Yes.
All right. And he received a double lung transplant in 2019 after being diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at the age of 3. Wes works full-time at Starbucks as a manager. He's going to give us all the inside information about the fall drinks, I'm sure. And then he graduated from Oklahoma State University with a degree in hotel and restaurant administration in 2016. He lives on his family's ranch, enjoys reading, cooking for friends and family, and yard work. Yard work, that never would be something that I would pick. You're going to have to come over and help me sometime, Wes.
Oh my gosh, it is so therapeutic. I absolutely love it.
Isn't it really? I'm so glad you think so. And then in addition to Wes, we're going to have James and Kritisha Anderson. They live in Kansas City, Kansas, and have been married for 14 years. They have 5 children and 2 grandchildren. Kritisha was transplanted in 2017. She had a kidney transplant in 2017 after a year and a half on dialysis. And James was her care partner throughout that process. Together, the couple advocates and supports for other families in their transplant journey. Kritisha remains very active, working full-time as a school bus driver. Things are ramping up again for you, being real busy, and also volunteers her time in the lupus support community as well as transplant support communities, and recently participated in the transplant games, right?
Yes.
And you were pretty successful there. Do you want to brag for a minute?
Yes, I received a gold medal in bowling and a silver medal in beanbag toss. So I'm not
I love that.
Just a surprise he was that I got it.
That's cool. Well, awesome. So that is something, if you're not familiar with the transplant games, that's something for people who are in the post-transplant phase of care where you couldn't kind of participate in all manner of sports, right?
Yes.
Cool. Well, today we're going to be talking a lot about the topic of stress and stress as it relates to transplant specifically. So my background professionally is as a licensed clinical social worker. So I'm going to be leaning on some of those therapeutic skills to kind of help explain some of the coping skills and some of the definitions and things going on with where we get concerned with stress. This presentation was really created to prepare or deal with the stress that happens prior to transplant. If you're kind of sitting here wondering, gosh, but I'm wondering about the post-transplant phase of care, don't worry, we're going to discuss that at our next transplant talk in December. I still think a lot of this information will be valuable, so stick with us. So we're going to talk about and learn some skills for coping, and then learn from Wes, Kritisha, and James about how they coped with things that were going on during their transplant journey. So this information is not only for the patients, but like I said, the care partners and the entire team. You know, it takes a village for a transplant to be successful. And so we want everyone to be able to utilize these coping skills and these tips and techniques. So simply put, stress really is the body's reaction to mental, physical, or emotional pressure. So I think we can all understand times when things are stressful, and really there's sometimes no greater stress than being sick. I thought this graphic was really neat. It kind of shows how your health conditions can cause physical symptoms, pain, and limitations, which cause stress, and then the stress can kind of exacerbate a lot of those symptoms, causing low mood, worry and anxiety, irritability and anger, isolation, stuff like that, that then also can exacerbate some of the symptoms you may have of your organ failure. Altogether, making it, if you're not coping well with your stress, you're not going to be coping well with your illness, and it'll be hard to kind of stay on track. So there's lots of different kinds of stressors. So we're going to talk a little bit about what different kinds of stressors there are in the transplant process. And then after we discuss different types of stressors, we'll discuss how to address each of these types of things. So first, it seems pretty obvious to discuss the idea of medical stressors. The unexpected loss of health, or the change of your health, can cause significant stress. The medical stressors in transplant can be something ranging from symptom management all the way to just like the pain of everyday stuff. But luckily, research does show that patients can affect their outcome of their transplant by their ability to cope well. Kritisha, I wanted to kind of ask you first, how can this idea talking about how stress is kind of circular with your a medical condition, can you relate to that at all, or what do you think of that?
Yes, that is a very common stressor. I experienced that firsthand, but I learned that if I educated myself on the things that were going on with me medically, ask a lot of questions, be my best advocate, for me, that helped me to deal with a lot of the medical stressors.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there about educating yourself and being your best advocate. What do you think, was there anything specific going on with, having to maintain peritoneal dialysis and just sort of the transplant evaluation process that you found particularly medically stressful?
I think going back on dialysis, because I had done dialysis previously as a teenager, and then second time as an adult, going back on it that second time, I knew things had changed over the years as far as peritoneal dialysis. So what I did was I decided to just be proactive. Before I actually even started dialysis, I started to take the educational classes that were offered by the dialysis center and that kind of thing, so that I could familiarize myself again with the peritoneal dialysis process.
Yeah, so kind of lessen the amount of questions so you can feel a little more educated.
Yes.
Yeah. Wes, I'm curious if you had anything in your lead up to transplant, being diagnosed at such a young age, you probably knew for a long time that your medical condition would worsen. I wonder how you coped with that, or what kind of stress came along with it.
Yes, absolutely. So being diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, and eventually on the back burner in your mind, you're probably more likely than not going to have a double lung transplant sooner rather than later. And we all hope it's later rather than sooner, obviously, because you want to try to live the best life you can, because transplant is so uncertain. You have to pass so many tests and procedures and criteria and evaluations to be on that, to be considered a good transplant candidate. And I mean, you can say luckily, but in hindsight, yes, everybody who receives the transplant is lucky, but I had a lot of outside close experience and advice from the cystic fibrosis community, years of it, because people before me with CF received their transplants, and I knew these people very well. So that being said, it is very stressful, but you also have to keep in your mind that not every transplant is the same. Your body will react differently than what my friend Danny's body did, what Katisha's body reacted to her kidney, my lungs with my body. There is no two transplant cases that are similar. So that is stressful in itself.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about what you said, Wes, is the idea of kind of leaning on a community of people who have been there before. And I think that's such a powerful endorsement of the idea of mentorship. The idea that sometimes it's important to really hear a firsthand perspective. Some of the medical stressors that we know that patients leading up to transplant are going through can make you feel kind of lonesome. Some of those things can be kind of isolating. The practice of having to do peritoneal dialysis every night. You got to go home early. You can't always be out and about. You got to be home in time to start your cycler, or, with the lung transplant, maybe being on oxygen and you can't schlep everything all over the place all the time. It can be really difficult. And then, like you said too, Wes, just the idea of the evaluation itself has lots of extra tests and new medicines, which can really affect your health and therefore affecting your stress level.
Yeah, and it's stressful enough as it is being healthy, but when you do it and you're so sick, like Katisha can relate to that, being sick and having these procedures and tests done takes a huge amount of energy that your body doesn't have. So it makes it seem like it's never going to end.
That's interesting. Kind of that, it sounds like you're saying that feeling of just here, here we go again, just it keeps happening.
Yeah, it's like a double-edged sword. There is an end and it's going to hopefully end well, but it's also like, when is it going to end?
Yeah.
I'm tired of being poked and prodded.
Sure. James, I'm curious how that experience was for you, helping your wife with some of these medical things. That's a lot to ask of a husband, of a care partner. How did you guys kind of find that to work for you?
A lot of times she educated me because she was already educated from being on dialysis before. And so it kind of helped that she was already educated, but then, when I go to the clinic with her, I get to hear about what they're going to talk about, what plans they're going to do, or other things that she's involved in that care. And so it really helped, for me to be there to hear it from someone else, or from, the doctor or something like that. So I might not understand all the terminology, but she was always there to kind of help me understand that. But it really helped for me to go to those doctor visits with her.
So go ahead, Katisha.
I was going to say, from a patient's perspective, when you get that long list of things that you have to do to prepare for your transplant, that can be overwhelming. And so what I did was I took my list and I decided I was going to check at least one thing off of my list every month. So if it was going to do the stress test, I'm going to do that this month. Going to the dentist, I'll do that next month. And I thought that really helped to alleviate a lot of that stress.
So kind of taking it in small bites.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
I'm so glad that you
similar. Oh, you can
go ahead.
It's similar. I don't know if you guys have heard of the spoons theory, where you only have so many spoons in a day, and you lose a spoon if you or you have to give up a spoon to get up out of bed and get dressed. Well, there's one spoon. Then you lose another spoon to go to work. You lose another spoon to work out. And throughout the day, you're losing spoons. Us who have had transplants or been diagnosed with medical conditions, we only have so many spoons versus an able-bodied individual who has double, triple, quadruple the amount of spoons a day. So it's just
that idea.
I learned about it when I was younger and I've used it often, and it's interesting for the people that I advocate for when I speak, because let's just talk about the spoon theory.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. You can look it up. There's a whole lot more to it.
I love that. My kids have this book about a bucket, and it's like every time something bad happens, a little bit of water spills out of your bucket. Or if something good happens, or if you do something that helps you feel good, you can put water back in your bucket. And so sometimes I think about that too. Like sometimes my bucket feels like it is just running dry. And that's kind of when you know you need to call on some of those coping skills, right?
Yes.
But I love the visual of spoons too, especially the idea that, okay, I might have 30 spoons a day, and someone who is, you know, having to suffer from a chronic illness, they may only have 5, you know, so
Yeah, and you
where
have
are
to
you
use
going
your
to
spoons
spend those
wisely.
spoons? That's really, I bet, a powerful visual for people too that may not be used to dealing with chronic illness. Kind of the idea of, okay, this is the amount of energy, or, you know, to visualize, this is the kind of the resources you have, and maybe the resources someone else has. That's a good way to think of it. Another type of thing that can cause stress in our lives is just kind of those day-to-day instrumental demands. Some of the things that, while healthy, we kind of take for granted, right? Like simple things, kind of like what you were saying, Wes, cooking, house cleaning, paying the bills, making sure everything is being addressed on a daily basis. Driving to your appointments. Are you driving yourself to your appointments, or do you have to ask someone? That can kind of, you know, all chip away in a way. So I'm wondering, you know, if prior to transplant, was there anything in an instrumental way that you found like more stressful, things that you found that you were having trouble doing, or maybe having to call on others for help with?
Who wants, I don't know, who wants to go first?
You can go, Wes.
Okay, all of it, because I mean, my sickness with my lung failure went so fast. I was doing very well, and then all of a sudden, within 48 hours, I was in lung failure and ended up I was at 30% lung function for like 5 years, very stable. I thought I was the healthiest I've ever been, and I was, and it declined so rapidly within about less than 3 weeks total. Right before transplant, I ended with 9% lung function left. And just seeing that downhill slide, I moved in with my mom. Her parents, my grandparents, came and helped take care of me. My papa would come help my mom on the ranch. My Nana would help take care of me because she was a retired RN with the whole alphabet behind her name. So it was just that huge support system. I couldn't go out without having anxiety attacks. I couldn't sit up out of bed, get dressed without having these huge panic attacks. And to the point where I needed to be somewhat heavily medicated to keep from having those panic attacks, because when you can't breathe at all, a panic attack's really not the best thing to do. And
Yeah.
it's easier said than done, because you just want to breathe so bad and your lungs have one job and they're not doing that job. And I mean, and the house that I lived in with my mom was huge, and the 50-foot oxygen tubing was perfect. I even had to put the oxygen concentrator, which his name was Bob, on an extension cord because the house was so big. It was a big L, and I wasn't about to unplug that thing and risk 2 seconds without oxygen. But it took me probably a good hour and a half to 2 hours every morning and night to get started and go to bed, because I had to stop so frequently to take breaths. Bathing, the hot water, the steam, it makes you lightheaded, it makes you nauseous, you just don't have energy. By the time you get yourself clean or need assistance, you're done.
Yeah,
There's no ifs and or buts about you need a nap, or you just want to go to bed until tomorrow.
Yeah.
And your body just goes through so much energy trying to do what it's doing in overdrive, that all you want to do is lay around, watch TV and sleep. So
sometimes it's so
very
important,
a hard feeling,
just to give yourself that grace and that time, right? I mean, our body is a machine, and if a part of the machine isn't working right, then the whole thing is just going to start kind of slowing down and not able to do its job. The relationship between all the organs, it's also important. So even if you have one organ that's not working well, or sometimes people have 2 organs transplanted at the same time, it's really just your entire self and your whole life is disrupted. It's a huge issue. And you touched on an important point, Wes, and I'm curious, James, when I think about someone preparing for transplant and these types of instrumental stressors, the day-to-day around the house stuff, the driving, grocery shopping, doing bedtime with the kids, all that kind of stuff, it makes me think a lot about the importance of care partner support. I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit about maybe sometimes the stress and the burden that maybe a care partner may feel, the types of things that change and that kind of feel like a little heavy on you.
Well, so first of all, we are faith-based Christians, and so the first thing we did was we made the agreement that we're in it for life, and we're married, and till death do us part. So I think by having that mindset, I was willing to go the length, of whatever it's going to take for her to be comfortable. And so the more that she educated me on what needed to be done, but Katicia's so stringent on taking her medication, doing what the doctor say do, monitoring her body with its changes. And so it was a lot easier for me because she's the type of person that's always, on that. She go to the doctor, she's got a list of her medications instead of him trying to ask, what are you taking? Or, if she's having a problem with the medication, then she could tell the change. And so it really was easy for me because I looked at it as she's my wife. This is what we got to do. And we're in this together. So it just kind of became a routine. Every night for her to hook up is routine. Every morning for her to get off is routine. And so we just, I guess you say we made it routine instead of looking at it as this, it's the will to live.
Yeah.
This is what we got to do. So this is what we're doing.
Yeah. So maybe like a little stressful that changing period in the beginning, but then once y'all kind of worked out a routine that worked for your family, it just kind of became the next day-to-day thing.
Yeah. It was overwhelming at first to hear about she's finna go on dialysis again. And then, with her stressing out, how do I calm my wife down, or how do I deal with this part of she has been on this before and now she's a little stressed. So, you ask yourself all those questions, but then you don't have time for yourself to sit here and be stressed because you're not the one sick. She's the one sick. So the focus is always on her.
Yeah, that's a tough position to be in. I mean,
but you hate to see someone sick that you love and there's nothing you can do. So, okay, so now I got to set this aside because tonight I got to get her hooked up. Or I think it was one time, what was it with the needles you were doing? I don't remember. One time she was having to give herself injections.
Oh,
and
that's hard.
That's hard.
I'm so not the caregiver nurse. And
You're not a needle guy?
Well, I'll take a needle, but giving one, no.
Oh.
Yeah, and so it was through the stomach. And I guess I just didn't master that because she eventually just took it and said, hey, I'll just do it myself.
Never mind. You're not my helper.
I always told my mom.
Yeah,
I always told my mom, just think of.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You can finish, James.
I had to learn some things because I was not the caregiver kind of guy, but I had to say, hey, okay, this is my wife. This is what I signed up for. These are my vows, and God guide us. So, and that's what got me through is God. In the end of the day, this is what He wanted us to be. We both are divorcees, and so this is our second time around. And I've always looked at it as sometimes He has to take you through something to clean you up and prepare you to get you to where He wants you to be. And you look at us now, 14 years later.
Still killing it, doing a great job. You're gonna the next, maybe we should do a transplant talk about, we could do like a marriage seminar. James, you can lead it.
I don't know about that.
One of the things that when I was working as a transplant social worker, and I know comes up a lot, is when we talk about instrumental stuff, it's impossible to not acknowledge the idea of finances. That financial piece can be really stressful and burdensome. Kertisha, how did you kind of resolve some of that worry for yourself?
When I first started dialysis, I wanted to quit my job. And the social worker that I had at the dialysis clinic, she told me, she said, whatever you do, do not quit your job. You'll need that insurance.
I
And so I'm
remember that.
glad I
Yeah.
did not quit my job.
I remember
So that
that.
helped a lot as far as finances, paying for the transplant, medication, and that type of thing. So I was still able to work while I did dialysis, which was a great thing. And then of course, James works as well. So that's
Yeah.
family as well.
And something that we'll talk about a little bit later is how to use your resources, you know, in the transplant community to kind of reach out for help and ask. And then what feels like kind of something we're touching on a little bit as we talk is just the idea of emotional and existential stress, which kind of really go hand in hand. So I'm going to clump them together a little bit. Obviously we all kind of know what stress feels like as an emotion. You know, that heaviness in your chest, that kind of racing heart you can feel, that kind of panic feeling, sometimes even muscle aches, kind of feeling that tightness. And then existential stress, I feel like really goes hand in hand with the idea of having a potentially life-limiting illness. You know, transplant is, I used to tell my patients all the time, is not a cure for end-stage renal disease or end-stage liver disease or any of these diseases. It's simply the best available treatment. And so the idea of transplant is to extend and improve your quality of life. But we all have to an extent, grapple with the idea of existential stress, the idea that, you know, the limitations of our existence are scary, and even more so when you're really confronted with them, or confronted with the realization that someone you love may have, you know, a limited time. So kind of the types of things we see in that idea is just kind of maybe feeling guilty or blaming yourself for your disease process, especially for people that if they quote unquote cause their disease through any, you know, smoking, substance use, not maintaining their diabetes well, or high blood pressure. At the end of the day, you know, the treatment is the same and it can be really overwhelming. So being able to kind of lessen some of that worry. Kertisha, one of the things you have shared with me that kind of was a bit of an existential stressor was the idea that at first you were wanting to maybe identify a potential living donor, and then when that was not a possibility for you, that idea of waiting for a deceased donor and the kind of your thought process around that. I'm curious if you want to share that.
Sure. My thought process after I wasn't able to receive a living donor and knew that I would have to receive a kidney from a deceased donor was, someone actually has to die for me to live. And that kind of gave me somewhat of a guilty feeling. But then I had to realize that that person's death was out of my control, and that my kidney was a gift. And this was something that they wanted to give me. So that really helped put everything into perspective.
I feel like that's such a powerful and big mind shift. It probably took some time.
Yeah. It doesn't happen overnight. That's for sure. Yeah.
And Wes, you had kind of shared that you thought kind of your time on the wait list, while brief, was kind of the worst part. Could you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Kind of piggybacking on what Kertisha said, some people, you know, it never bothers them that they're going to receive a deceased or person's organ, or some people it does. And for me, being born with CF and being diagnosed at 3 and knowing the end result, I had many years to kind of cope with this. I juggled in my head, No, I'll never get a transplant. Yes, I will. No, I won't. I don't want this. I've seen too many of my friends' families go through grief, etc. Um, but then when it finally came down to it, absolutely, you can only cough up blood and live on 9% lung function for so long. And when I was presented with, I call the T word, transplant, I was just sitting there, just kind of mellow as ever from medication. I was like, okay, fine, let's do it. And I was immediately gung ho with it until getting home and receiving the phone call about 3 weeks later, um, that I was actively listed. That's when it kind of hit me. I was like, okay, it was real, but now it's really real. And now I have to
Yeah.
keep my phone has to be on loud. You can't ignore any phone calls that are unknown or a 405 number from my hospital in Oklahoma City. Anything that pops up like that. And I have a ringtone on my phone. It's NFL Sports Center because it reminds me of my dad who's not with us anymore. And it got so stressful. I would be just sitting there, not even thinking about my phone, just watching TV with my mom. And anytime it'd ring, even if it was just an unknown caller or my brother messing with me just to get a rise out of me, I would jump like a cat that just got spooked because any given phone call could be that phone call. And while you're hoping that phone call is the call, there's also a chance that, like on the slide here, it could be a dry run. So you could get worked up, you could go to the hospital, get ready to go into anesthesia, or even get about to be put under, get your labs started, whatever the process might be. Until they get that final visual and say so, you don't know if that is going to be a go or no go. And
Yeah.
that was the most terrifying part. I was in the hospital 4-5 days before I got my transplant, and I was discharged. But the last 4 days of that 2-week hospital stay, because I started coughing up blood again, 4 nights in a row, back to back, I had these really weird gut feelings and I couldn't sleep. I was very stressed, and I had to increase my medications because, as I found out the next morning, they had multiple offers for me 4 days in a row, which all ended up not being a go. And in that instance, I was glad they didn't notify me yet, because it's like, okay, he's already in the hospital. Let's make sure we can verify this first.
Yeah.
Because the stress that I was already under, I couldn't imagine what it would be, especially, I guess, kind of the letdown phase of
The
knowing, ooh,
stop
I have
start
this
of it all.
opportunity. Yeah, like you get all hyped up because it's going to happen, and then you get bummed because it's not going to happen and you have to wait again. But yeah, that was probably the worst part, other than the phone ringing.
I feel like transplant is a bit of a Wizard of Oz situation where you kind of see a lot of stuff going on the front end, or like a duck, where it seems all calm and still, but under the water, there's like a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah,
The transplant teams take great care not to cause extra stress, but
absolutely.
which is good, but kind of as you're illustrating, you're sensing it in a sense, and while I always would encourage people to feel thankful, that false alarm means, what I would communicate to people is, when you have a false alarm, or if you get a call and it turns out to not be the organ for you, what I encourage people to think of is, okay, well, that means my transplant team wants the very best possible fit for me. And something our surgeons I've worked with, from across multiple different centers, I've heard many iterations of it. If it isn't good enough for my mom, my wife, my kid, it's not good enough for you. And so that's how they think about it. If it isn't the perfect match, and while I'm sure a huge part of you is like, yes, good, I want it to be the perfect match, there's also another part saying like, okay, but these false
Hurry
alarms
up.
are really stressful and I don't want to deal with this anymore. It's really hard. So that is such an important thing to touch on, is the idea of like the stop start of it, and sometimes too, like if you're listed for transplant, but then you get, about a pneumonia, so you have to be put on pause, or you have a a dialysis line infection, you have to be put on pause. And so it can be really stressful, that stop and start. And that's an interesting piece to touch on. So we've talked a lot about the things that make us stressed, right? Now what do we do? We're going to be stressed. What do you do with it? So living with a chronic illness, like we're discussing, can be stressful in and of itself. We touched on earlier, research shows that when people kind of take control of their own situation and engage in some of those active coping skills, even if it might not feel like it's making a big difference, research shows that that does go a long way. Sometimes I would talk to people and say, well, I don't have any choice but to keep going. I think it's so important to acknowledge the idea that we have choices every day, all day, right? So we can choose to do things that are helpful and keep going, or we can also choose, even if it doesn't feel like an option, it absolutely is an option to choose dysfunctional coping skills. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So we're going to talk about 3 types of coping. Problem-focused coping, which is also kind of referred to as solution-focused coping. In general, coping is basically just any person's effort to manage demands on themselves. Things that are exceeding your ability to deal with it and feeling stressful, how are you going to address it? Problem-focused, we'll talk a little bit about that. Kind of talking about changing your situation by identifying the problem and how to move through that problem. Some problems are very out of our control. And for those problems, we kind of turn to more of an emotion-focused coping. How do we deal with the things, even day to day, that feel outside of our control, because they're numerous, especially as we've discussed the idea of transplant. It's just a big waiting game, and that feeling of lack of control over something so huge can feel very overwhelming. So having a way to internally, person to person, whatever feels best, to deal with it is important. And then we'll touch briefly on the idea of dysfunctional coping. Sometimes things that are, used to cope with stress that aren't the best coping skill. But I think in truth, people we use these things all the time, even if they aren't our best option. So first, the idea of dysfunctional coping, the maladaptive, that's such a big word, but basically things that aren't going to improve the situation and may sometimes exacerbate or make the situation worse. Sometimes some of these things can start off as not so bad, like self-distraction. I'm going to play Angry Birds on my phone while I, have to sit through this dialysis session. That's okay. But is it getting to the point where you're not engaging with your care? You're not listening to your care team? I think denial is something that a lot of people have to move through in the journey to transplant. Even if it's brief, oh God, this is not happening to me. I don't want to deal with this, that kind of inner dialogue. Kurtisha, did you find yourself kind of creating any bad habits, or kind of, was any of this an issue for you?
Eating.
Yeah,
eating, especially like watermelon, which would set my potassium through the roof.
And your fluid restriction, I'm sure you got in trouble.
The nurse would call me and say, go to the hospital, your potassium level is through the roof. So I was eating probably for me.
Wes, did you find yourself, especially I would think as a child, adolescent, early adult, that kind of sense of self, you're getting to know yourself, and kids, we know their brains aren't fully developed and may not understand consequences. Did you find yourself kind of engaging in any of these things that weren't the best decision?
They weren't necessarily bad decisions, but it was also something that obviously sometimes you do these decisions because they're enjoyable. mine, and even my counselor that I still see, love her, she always asks me, mine was shopping. And I love shopping, and it's a way that I can, if I have a bad doctor's appointment day or something, I would just, let's go to Barnes and Noble and spend 3 hours in the bookstore. Even though I have 8 books at home that I haven't touched yet, let's go buy 6 more. What's that going to hurt? Or new clothes, new shoes, things like that. Other than that, it was probably just right prior to transplant, because the reason it was determined why my lungs went into failure was I had an aneurysm on my main bronchial trunk from inflammation and just raw cystic fibrosis just taking its course. And so I made it a point, because my doctors told me if I had another hemoptysis or coughing up blood episode as severe as the initial, that I might not make it. So I was very conscious about getting up super fast or picking up something too heavy or laughing and really try not to cough as much as I could, because that was in the back of my mind. So it limited what I was doing, but it wasn't, I was still being active, but there was a very fine line. It's like, okay, I want to make sure I'm as healthy as I can, but I know for my mental health and to be the healthiest I can going into transplant that I still need to be active. So I would just do laps around the house, or I would do wall sits, or just something minor that would actually get my blood flowing.
That's smart. While still
While
trying to
reading
be
and looking at
mindful
everything.
of your restrictions.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think that while we can recognize that dysfunctional coping skills exist, they're obviously not the goal, right? So we're going to talk next a little bit about the idea of problem-focused coping or solution-focused coping, kind of the same word, interchangeable. So this kind of is the idea of coping strategies aiming to eliminate sources of stress or to work with the stressors themselves. If there are things you can't do anything about, how can you address them? We're talking about the idea, the experience of being diagnosed with a terminal illness or a lifelong illness. They're going to be kind of that feeling of powerlessness or lack of control is going to go hand in hand with that, unfortunately. So I guess I'm wondering, I'm going to pick on you first, James. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about how you and Curticia came to the idea of what type of dialysis that Curticia was going to do. Sort of taking us through the idea of, if we're going to choose a problem and it's, okay, we know that Curticia is going to have to do dialysis, what happens next?
For us, it was almost clear. She knew she didn't want to have to go to the clinic, but with her and her job and everyday life, the way my job is set up to where I'm gone a lot of times. So PD was no brainer. But you take, when the problems come along, you take your worst day that you can imagine, and you got a choice. You either handle this and deal with it the right way and say, I want to live today, so this is what I got to do, or I'm going to be sick. And so that's what got us through, is whenever a problem came along, even touching back on when you was talking about a dry run. She had an episode to where she had a dry run, and it just like crushed her. But we got back home, we was like, okay, it didn't happen. We got to keep moving though. We still got to live.
Yeah.
We still got to get on this machine every day. We still got to get off this machine. This is what's keeping us alive right now until we do get a kidney. The other thing for us was when problems came along, like I said, Curticia is so stringent on her medications, staying in touch with her doctors, keeping her files at hand from one doctor to another, because she's got a lot of doctors, even dealing with lupus. And so, she always had that information. The best thing I can tell anybody that's going through any kind of sickness, the first and foremost thing that you need to make sure you got behind you is a support team. without that support team, because when she's having a bad day, when she's having a problem or illness, you know, dealing with something that's going on with the illness that she has, your support team got to be there to say, hey, okay, come on. I need to get you on your feet. Hey, come on. I need to get you. Hey, come on. What do you need? I got it. You just lay here. I'll go get it. So your support team is number one.
I agree. I do want to point something out to you though. First, I want to illustrate the idea of kind of the problem we were discussing. It occurred to me that people might not realize that there are two different kinds of dialysis. That hemodialysis is done in the center at a doctor's office, essentially, for 3 to 4 hours, 3 to 4 times a week. And then peritoneal dialysis is something you do at home. You kind of hook up to a hose in your tummy and it fills your belly with fluid and it empties it and kind of works alternatively to the kidney in that way. But it is quite a time commitment.
Yes.
So that's the first thing I want to point out, just in case we have anybody who's not totally familiar. And then the other thing I want to say, James, is you're kind of doing exactly what I said. The idea of not acknowledging the fact that you are making a choice, that by saying it was a no-brainer to just hop back on the horse and just get back to doing what we were doing, that is a choice. That is a very conscious choice. And that is choosing not to, to give yourself some time and say, okay, that was upsetting. And that was a big letdown. And now we have a choice. We have a choice to, am I gonna take a couple weeks and be just kind of not doing my dialysis the way I should because I'm feeling bad and I'm feeling sorry for myself, which is a totally valid choice to feel that way. And it's also an alternatively very valid choice that will lead to better results, to kind of do what you said, to look at the problem and say, can I change this thing? No. What are the actions that I have before me? I can choose to disengage with my care. I can choose to get upset with my care team because they didn't transplant me fast enough. I can choose to, take a breather and then just get right back on the horse. These are all choices. So I think without realizing it, you're already kind of engaging in that. And I think it's important to acknowledge to ourselves that I am making good choices and my care team is making good choices and I am making good choices on behalf of my wife who is struggling, and I am choosing that every day. So I want to just point that out because I think that you might be losing that kind of piece for yourself to know just how much you did do. Does that make sense?
So we made a choice.
Yeah. Wes, what do you think about, did you have anything during your evaluation that kind of necessitated this sort of decision-making, making a plan kind of action?
No, not really. During the evaluation phase anyway, it was all prior. So when I was in the hospital initially during the hemoptysis spell and those 2 procedures, bronchial artery embolizations to fix the bleeding, my mom and I it was never said, but it was like one of those things that, okay, transplant's going to happen, but we're not going to jinx it. We don't talk about it, it won't happen. I'll recover like I always have. I'll go back home, go back to work, all this jazz. But it was one of those things that was in your head always. You knew, you're like, okay, when are they going to come in and say I need a transplant? Even though, I was doing laps around this hospital like I thought I was Speedy Gonzalez and I'm moving like a snail. But that was just my drive because exactly what James was saying, I felt the same. To me, it didn't feel like I made a choice, but it was ultimately a choice. And I knew, I was like, okay, you have to give it your all. I know I have an awesome support system. I know I'm healthy enough to get through it. And I trust my care team to guide me through this. And I never really had much survivor's guilt about, actually, I take that back. I don't know where I was going with that last point, but
That's okay.
I call it,
It sounds
yeah, I
like
call it transplant brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it just goes away. But
but I
no,
hear what you're saying there,
it
the
was a
idea
choice.
that you were engaging in taking good care of yourself, making sure that you're continuing to follow your care plan of,
Yeah,
you could totally take a week on the couch and you're gonna kind of lose some of that reserve, or you were
yes.
doing a really good job of, okay, I know I'm gonna have to deal with this transplant, let me stay active, let me keep my body busy so that when I'm recovering from surgery, I'm really prepared.
Yeah, and it just came back to me. Yeah, it's the sense of I made it to 26 as healthy as I thought I was. I never thought I could be healthier at 26. Then the aneurysm in my lungs happened. And then being presented with the transplant word, I knew, I was like, well, if I made it this far on 30% declining lungs, how far could I potentially make it if I received these brand new, beautiful
Right.
lungs? Like the picture perfect comparison of what my lungs look like to my donors, night and day.
Yeah, it's
So
startling.
yeah, it is. And knowing I lived with these for 26 years and I was doing the best I could,
Yeah.
how much farther on a scale, if I could only do this far, how much further could I go with lungs working at 100%? So that was what drove me. Plus, I'm a very independent person. I hate asking for help unless I'm like, of course, like I was dying on my bed in the hospital, like, fine, you can help me. I'll
Twist my
accept it.
arm.
Well, yeah, it's like, just twist my arm, make me do it, whatever. I'll still be bitter about it, but I'll let you do it. Um, it's just one of those things that you have to get through it. It's just a point in life. You either get through it or you don't, and you just have to keep moving.
Have to.
Um,
Yeah.
and
Well,
the
I
support system
feel,
is there.
yeah, I feel like you guys are delivering a lot of the same message. And I think that I like that you and Kurtisha and James all have kind of the same thought process of like, okay, let's just keep moving forward. There are going to be obstacles along the way. Let's approach those obstacles as they come and just keep it moving.
Exactly. And not to say everybody who goes through transplant has the same mentality as we do, because some of my best friends haven't had that mentality, and I've reached out to them or they've reached out to me way before I even thought about needing a transplant, just because I wanted to talk. And I mean, you could give advice, you can be their shoulder to cry on, you could be that ear for them, but at the end of the day, it's their decision, and how they
Yeah.
process it and accept this change in life is totally up to them.
I think too, this is an important place where if you're filled with more questions than answers, when you're choosing a problem, thinking about actions to solve the problem, and you just feel like, I don't know how and where to solve this problem, that's a really good time to reach out to your transplant team, and to talk
Yes.
to your coordinator, talk to the financial coordinator if your questions are financial. If you're wanting to seek therapy or additional assistance with something, the social worker is available to help. If you have to travel and things feel overwhelming, that's what your transplant team is for. Alternatively, the idea of a mentor is really nice, kind of discussing with someone who's had a transplant before. How did you approach this? Or what did this look like for you? Having someone to talk to before you're transplanted that kind of can show you, okay, so this does happen and this is powerful. And while my journey may not be the same as Sarah's transplant journey, it still is nice to have someone to ask questions to, where you don't feel so alone or like your experience is just your own and singular. It can feel like a little more of a community effort.
Oh, for sure. And kind of to touch on earlier what Kritisha and James were talking about, they're Christians and they went to praying. As soon as when I felt like I was at my wit's end and I could not go on anymore, I would just turn to my mom, whether I was in the hospital or not. I'm like, let's call Nana and Papa. I need to pray. And I was on prayer chains from every Texas Roadhouse, because that's where I worked at the time, in Oklahoma, to my family in Texas, and to some other Texas Roadhouses in West Virginia and South Carolina, because of that huge family community. And that was a huge driving force as well, because I
For
mean,
sure.
not everybody is religious or spiritual, but everybody has their resolutions and ways to turn.
Well, and I think, and even if your idea isn't like that people are praying for me, alternatively, it's like, gosh, think about all these people that are just out there supporting me, that are out there loving
Yeah.
me and wanting the best for me. And that's kind of when we turn to this emotion focused coping, right? Like, transplant's coming, you're on this train, it's moving, it's left the station, here we go. I'm feeling overwhelmed because I can't steer the train, right? Or I don't know where my stop is going to be. And we're just like powering ahead and it all feels kind of out of control. So the idea of prayer is such a powerful one. I think too, we hear a lot of people saying, like, Wes, you touched on this, exercising, those endorphins and things like this, talking to friends, talking to family. Again, a mentor. This is a wonderful resource for a mentor, because I feel like, and you guys have touched on this a little bit, the having a transplant, if you don't have anybody to talk to that's had one, can feel a little lonely and isolating. And Wes, you've touched a lot on how, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what it meant for you to have mentors in your community that had been transplanted before, and how that helped your experience.
So the first person that I met that I really remember with CF was Danny, and we ended up actually going to OSU together our freshman year. And we had cystic fibrosis, same mutations, but just like transplant, cystic fibrosis isn't the same with everybody. So Danny's case with cystic fibrosis was a little bit more serious. She spent a lot more time in the hospital than I did. She has since passed away, but myself and her family and our families are still very close. So Danny and I were very open, and we would, we knew it's going to happen. And then I met Taylor, then I met Sky, and the people that I just kept meeting going on. Some of them were already post-transplant, and it's like, how did this happen? Like, tell us all your knowledge. So just being exposed to that, and honestly, never feel embarrassed to ask questions.
Yeah.
I love
Never.
that.
There is never there. I know your teachers tell you in school there's no such thing as stupid questions, especially when it comes to a life-changing procedure such as transplant. It is a
Absolutely.
life adjustment, and you need to know anything and everything you possibly can. So having that going into it, I'm like, okay, Danny had this, Taylor had that, Sky had that, Seth was going to have that, so and so, so and so, so and so, so and so. And there was always a common denominator. It always ended, it's like having a good support system. Okay, make sure you're compliant with your medications, because you can't just decide not to take your medications one day.
Yeah.
There's just all of this, and you can put all that together in one and decide what you want to do with your life and yourself in this post-transplant world.
Absolutely.
I feel like it helped bridge a lot of gaps, and there's still things that I'm learning today. Like, I have a new transplant doctor, and I meet the other new doctor in September. So it's like, what do they have to offer me? Just things like that, it just makes it so much easier. And I've even had people that I don't even know, they message me on social media, like, tell me about your story. How did you cope with this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And in your mind, I'm sure I'm sure people have reached out to James and Kritisha. You're like, why are you asking me these questions? I'm no hero, but we just chose to do what we thought was right. And then it actually helped somebody else. So we're like, wow, they trusted our knowledge and our experience with their life.
Yeah.
So it's a very warming feeling.
Good. There's such a thirst for knowledge, it's like, okay, let me understand this as well as I can, so that when I'm transplanted, I can be prepared. We're getting very close to our time. Kritisha, I want to ask you if there's anything you want to touch on before we close out and I wrap things up.
Just one last thing.
Yeah.
I think that is good to add to that list of ways to manage stress. For us, we use humor. We laugh a lot. I talk
Yes.
about my tacrolimus and what it does to my body and that kind of thing. So
The
I think,
shakes.
yeah, Humor is
James is a regular comedian over there, so I know you just stay laughing, Corticia.
yes, ma'am.
James would always make me laugh when you guys would come to your appointments. It always cracked me up. And I think that that's such a good point. Dealing with all this with the, you know, a sense of humor is important if you can maintain it. So, you know, I really was so excited to host you guys. And, you know, in December, we're going to be having a new batch of Transplant Mentors discussing the idea of emotions and coping, you know, during that initial hospital phase of your transplantation, and then in the years following, how to deal with all those changes that come after, you know, the things you're hopeful for, but then you can get a lot of curveballs after transplant too. As I said, your medical treatment is not over. You still have to engage quite a lot. I have a little reference page here on the end if anyone's interested in looking up any of those articles that we were referenced in the talk. Otherwise, I just want to thank you guys, Corticia, James, and Wes. Thank you so much for participating. If you are viewing this and curious about engaging with a mentor, you can go to giftdonor.org and contact me there, or just Google Gift of Life Transplant Mentors and get in touch. I'd love to set you up with a mentor. It might be one of these lovely people from today's conversation. Thanks again, guys. We'll talk soon.
All right.
Of course.
Bye.
Bye. Nice to meet y'all.
Nice to meet you.